Radomski said of you that you had read a lot of poetry and were extremely cultivated for your position, that you were a bookish woman with lily-white hands. Add to that your vanity and there are all your motives. And aren't your hands lily-white? Things had reached this unexpected juncture much too quickly and crudely unexpected because Nastasia Philippovna, on her way to Pavlovsk, still cherished certain dreams, though of course she anticipated things to turn out badly rather than otherwise. Aglaya was really carried away by the emotional surge of the moment, as if rushing down a mountainside, and couldn't resist the dreadful satisfaction of revenge. It was strange for Nastasia Philippovna to see Aglaya like this. She was looking at her as if she couldn't believe her eyes, and was decidedly at a loss for the first moment or two. Whether she was a woman who had read too much poetry, as Radomski had supposed, or simply mad, as the prince was convinced, at all events this woman, whose behavior was sometimes cynical and insolent, was in reality far more shy, gentle, and trusting than might have been assumed. True, there was in her a good deal that was bookish, dreamy, self-enclosed, and fantastical, but it existed along with qualities of strength and profundity. The prince understood this, his distress showed in his face. Aglaya noticed it and quivered with hatred. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she said with an indescribably imperious air, as she responded to Nastasia Philippovna's remark. "You must have misheard," marveled Nastasia Philippovna. "How have I spoken to you? If you had wanted to be an honest woman, then why didn't you get rid of your seducer, Totsky, just, without histrionics," said Aglaya suddenly, out of the blue. "What do you know of my situation that lets you presume to sit in judgment on me?" Nastasia Philippovna trembled and went pale. "All I know is that you didn't go to work, you went off with a rich man like Rogozin, so you could play the fallen angel. I'm not surprised Totsky wanted to shoot himself to escape a fallen angel." "Stop it!" Nastasia Philippovna said with revulsion and seeming anguish. "You understand me no better than Daria Alexeyevna's maidservant, who took her fiancé to court the other day for breach of promise. She'd have understood better than you. Most likely she's an honest girl and works for a living. How can someone like you speak of a maidservant with contempt?" "I don't regard work with contempt, just you when you talk of work. If you'd wanted to be an honest woman, you'd have taken in washing." Both rose to their feet and stared at one another, ashen-faced. "Aglaya, stop it. This is unfair," the prince cried despairingly. Rogozin listened with lips pursed and arms folded, no longer smiling. "There, just look at her," said Nastasia Philippovna, shaking with anger, "at that noble young lady. And I used to think she was an angel. Have you come visiting without your governess, Aglaya Ivanovna? Do you want me to tell you now bluntly, without mincing words, why you've come here? You were afraid, that's why you came to see me." "Afraid of you?" asked Aglaya, beside herself with naive and haughty amazement that the other should address her in this fashion. "Of course of me. If you've made up your mind to come and see me, it means you're afraid of me. If you fear someone, you don't despise them. To think I've respected you up to this very moment. And let me tell you why you're afraid of me and what your chief anxiety is now. You wanted to make sure personally whether he loved me more than you or not, because you're dreadfully jealous. He's already told me he hates you," Aglaya just managed to falter. "Perhaps he has, perhaps I'm not worthy of him, but you're lying, I think. He can't possibly hate me and he couldn't have said that. However, I'm willing to let it pass, bearing in mind your situation. I did think better of you, though. I thought you were more intelligent, and prettier too, honestly I did. Well, take your treasure then, there he is, looking at you, he can't take it all in, take him home with you, but on one condition, get out of here at once. This very minute. She fell into a chair and dissolved into tears. But all of a sudden something new glittered in her eyes, she stared fixedly at Aglaia and rose to her feet. Or would you like me to order him this minute, you hear? One order from me and he'll leave you at once and stay with me forever, and marry me, while you run home on your own. You want that? You want that? She shouted like a mad creature, perhaps not fully believing herself capable of uttering such words. Aglaia made to rush for the door, but halted on the threshold as if rooted to the spot and went on listening. If you like, I'll get rid of Rogozin. Did you think I was going to marry him to suit you? I'll shout out now in front of you, go away, Rogozin, and I'll say to the prince, remember what you promised? Lord, why have I humiliated myself so before them? Wasn't it you, prince, assured me that you'd marry me, whatever happened to me, and would never leave me, that you loved me and forgave me everything, and that you RSP. Yes, you said that as well. And I ran away from you just to set you free, but now I don't want to. Why has she treated me like some loose woman? Ask Rogozin whether I'm a loose woman, he'll tell you. Now that she has put me to shame before your very eyes, will you too spurn me and walk away arm in arm with her? Well, curse you then, because you were the only one I trusted. Go away, Rogozin, you're not wanted, she shouted, frenzied, forcing the words out of her breast, face contorted and lips parched, clearly not believing a word of her tirade but at the same time wanting to prolong the scene, if only by a second, and keep up the self-deception. The paroxysm was so intense that she might have died, so at least thought the prince. There he is, look, she cried at last to Aglaia, pointing to the prince. If he doesn't come up to me, now, take me, and give you up, then you can have him. I'll let you have him. I don't want him. Both she and Aglaia stood still, seemingly in suspense, then both looked at him as though demented. He, however, perhaps did not comprehend the full force of that challenge, indeed he certainly did not. All he saw before him was the distracted, despairing face which, as he had let slip to Aglaia once, pierced his heart forever. He could bear it no longer, and he turned to Aglaia with a look at once beseeching and reproachful, as he pointed to Nastasia Philippovna. How could you? She's really so unhappy. But that was all he managed to utter, as he was struck dumb by a terrible look from Aglaia. It contained so much anguish and at the same time such limitless hatred that he threw up his arms, uttered an exclamation, and darted towards her, but it was already too late. She had not been able to endure even an instant of hesitation. She covered her face with her hands, cried out, "Oh, my God," and rushed out of the room, followed by Rogozin to unbolt the front door for her. The prince also pursued her, but was clasped on the threshold by two arms. The ravaged, contorted face of Nastasia Philippovna was staring at him and her bluish lips stirred, asking him, "After her? After her?" She fell unconscious into his arms. He raised her and bore her into the room, and stood over her in numb suspense. There was a glass of water on the table. On his return to the room, Rogozin seized it and sprinkled some water in her face. She opened her eyes, and for a moment failed to realize what had happened. Then she suddenly looked round, gave a start, cried out, and rushed to the prince. "Mine! Mine!" she cried. "The proud young lady has gone?"
Ah.
She laughed hysterically.
Ah.
I was giving him up to that noble lady. But why should I? Why? Mad. Mad.
Get out, Rogozin. Ah!
Rogozin stared at them wordlessly, picked up his hat, and left. 10 minutes later the prince was sitting beside Nastasia Philippovna, his eyes fixed on her as he stroked her head and face with both hands, like a little child. He laughed when she laughed and was ready to cry when she cried. He said nothing, but listened intently to her jerky, rapturous, incoherent babbling, barely understanding anything, but smiling gently. As soon as he thought she was starting to fret or weep, reproach, or complain, he immediately began stroking her head again and passing his hands tenderly over her cheeks, comforting and soothing her like a child. 9. A fortnight had passed since the events related in the last chapter, and the situation of the characters in our story had altered to such an extent that we should find it difficult to continue without making certain things clear. We feel, however, that we should confine ourselves to a simple recital of the facts without any particular elaboration, as far as that is possible. The reason is a simple one: we ourselves find it difficult to explain what happened, in many cases. Such a statement on our part must appear very vague and strange. How can one tell a story if one has no clear notion of events or personal opinion regarding them? To avoid placing ourselves in a still more false position, it would be best if we attempted to clarify matters by giving an example, and then, perhaps, the indulgent reader will understand where our precise difficulty lies, particularly as this example will not be a digression. On the contrary, it will be a direct continuation of our story. During the subsequent 2 weeks, bringing us to the beginning of July, the tale of our hero, particularly the latest episode, had become transformed into a strange, vastly entertaining story of scandal, almost incredible and yet plain for all to see. This story had gradually spread through all the streets close to the villas belonging to Lebedev, the Titsins, Daria Alexeyevna, and the Epankins. In short, it was all round the town and even the surrounding districts. Virtually every element in society, locals, villa folk, music visitors, began telling one another the same story in 1,000 different versions: how a certain prince, after creating a scandalous scene in a well-known and respectable household, had thrown over the daughter of the family, to whom he was already engaged, and was now besotted with a cocotte. He had severed all his former ties, and despite everything, regardless of threats and universal public indignation, intended to marry this fallen woman in the next few days here in Pavlovsk, openly, in public, with head erect and looking everyone in the eye. The story became so embellished with scandalous details, so many celebrated and important figures were involved in it, and so various were the fantastic and mysterious nuances given to it, while on the other hand it was presented in such incontrovertible and concrete detail, that the general curiosity and gossip were, of course, very pardonable. The most subtle, ingenious and, at the same time, most plausible interpretation of the event was left to a few really serious gossip-mongers from that judicious section of the population who are invariably eager to explain events to others, whatever level of society they move in. This is where they find their vocation and often their consolation too. According to their version, a young man of good family, a prince, very nearly a rich man, something of a booby but a democrat and crazy over the modern nihilism revealed by Mr. Turgenev, and barely able to speak Russian, had fallen in love with one of General Epankin's daughters and had reached the point of being regarded in the household as the girl's fiancé. However, it was like that French seminarist in the papers recently, who deliberately allowed himself to be consecrated as a priest. Having begged to be thus consecrated, he had then gone through all the rites, genuflections, kissings, vows, and so on, only to declare publicly in a letter to his bishop the very next day that, as he didn't believe in God, he regarded it as dishonorable to deceive the people and live at their expense. He therefore renounced the priesthood he had assumed the day before. He had published his letter in the liberal newspapers. The prince had seemingly perpetrated some such subterfuge as had this atheist. The story went that he had deliberately waited for the formal engagement party at his fiancée's parents' house, where he was presented to great numbers of extremely important persons, only to trumpet his opinions, abuse the respectable dignitaries, reject his fiancée publicly and insultingly and, while resisting his ejection by the servants, smash a beautiful Chinese vase. They added, as an illustration of his contemporary mores, that the blockhead young man really did love his fiancée, the general's daughter, but had renounced her purely out of nihilism and for the sake of the subsequent scandal, so as not to forego the pleasure of marrying a fallen woman in front of the world, thus demonstrating his conviction that there were no such things as fallen women or virtuous women, there were only free women, that he did not believe in old-fashioned society divisions, all he believed in was the woman question. In his eyes, a fallen woman stood, if anything, slightly higher than one who was not. This explanation seemed wholly plausible and was accepted by the majority of the villa community, particularly as it was confirmed by day-to-day events. True, numerous things were left unaccounted for. It was said that the poor girl loved her fiancé, her seducer, some called him, so much that the very next day after he had rejected her, she ran to see him when he was sitting with his mistress. Others asserted that, on the contrary, she had been lured on purpose to his mistress's house, purely out of nihilism, that is, to heap shame and insult upon her. However that might be, interest in the affair increased daily, especially when there remained no shred of doubt that the scandalous marriage really was going ahead. And so, if we had been asked for an explanation, not about the nihilistic aspects of the affair, but just about how far the forthcoming wedding accorded with the prince's actual desires, what his desires actually were at any given moment, how one might describe our hero's state of mind, and so on and so forth, we should have had great difficulty in replying. We know only one thing, that the wedding was definitely fixed and that the prince himself had entrusted Lebedev, Keller, and some acquaintance of Lebedev's, whom the latter had introduced to the prince for the purpose, to undertake all the arrangements, religious and otherwise, that money was not to be stinted, that Nastasia Philippovna was insisting on the wedding and hurrying things along, that Keller had been chosen as the prince's best man, at his own ardent request, that Burdovsky, ecstatic at his appointment, was to give the bride away, and that the day of the wedding had been fixed for early July. But apart from these perfectly precise details, we know of several other facts which we are at a loss to account for, since they run counter to the previous ones. We strongly suspect that, after entrusting Lebedev and the others to oversee all the arrangements, the prince almost forgot the very same day that he actually had a master of ceremonies, a best man, or a wedding, and that if he had been in such a hurry to arrange for others to undertake the bothersome details, it was solely because he did not want to think about it himself, indeed, wanted perhaps to forget all about it as quickly as might be. What was he thinking of himself in that case then? What did he prefer to remember and what was he trying to achieve? Undoubtedly there was no question of any coercion involved either, from Nastasia Philippovna, for example. She really did want the wedding to take place as soon as possible, and it was her idea and certainly not the prince's, but the prince had acquiesced of his own free will, almost absently in fact, as if he had been asked to do something quite usual. We have a great many such odd facts before us, but so far from clarifying matters, in our view they actually cloud the issue. No matter how many are adduced, however, let us consider another example. Thus, we know for a fact that during that fortnight the prince passed whole days and evenings with Nastasia Philippovna, that she took him with her for walks and to listen to the music, that he rode about with her every day in her carriage, that he began to get anxious about her if an hour passed without seeing her, which meant, to all appearances, that he genuinely loved her, that he listened to whatever she had to say for hours on end, with a meek and gentle smile, saying almost nothing himself. But we also know that during those same days he went off several, indeed many, times to the Yapankins, without concealing the fact from Nastasia Philipovna, which drove the latter almost to despair. We know that while they remained in Pavlovsk the Yapankins did not receive him, and steadily refused to allow a meeting with Aglaya, that he would go away without a word, then return the very next day, as though completely forgetting the previous day's refusal and, of course, receive another refusal. We know, too, that an hour after Aglaya Ivanovna had run out of Nastasia Philipovna's house, or perhaps even sooner, the prince was already at the Yapankins, naturally confident of finding Aglaya there, and that his appearance had occasioned considerable alarm and dismay in the household, because Aglaya had not yet returned home, and it was only through him that they even learned she had gone out with him to Nastasia Philipovna's. It was said that Lizaveta Prokofievna, her daughters, and even Princess had been hostile and dealt harshly with the prince, and it was at this point that they denied him their further acquaintance and friendship in the strongest terms, especially when Varya suddenly appeared and announced that Aglaya Ivanovna had been in their house for an hour or more in a dreadful state, and seemed reluctant to return home. This last piece of news shocked Lizaveta Prokofievna most of all, and was perfectly true. Coming out from Nastasia Philipovna, Aglaya really would have consented to die rather than face the people at home, and so had rushed to see Nina Alexandrovna. Varya, for her part, had at once found it incumbent upon her to inform Lizaveta Prokofievna of all this without delay. Mother and daughters at once rushed round to Nina Alexandrovna, with the head of the household, General Yapankin, who had just arrived home, following on behind. Prince Lev Nikolaevich trailed after them as well, notwithstanding his expulsion and the hard words. By Varya's orders, however, he was not allowed to see Aglaya there either. The upshot was that, when Aglaya saw her mother and sisters weeping over her without a word of reproach, she flung herself into their arms and returned home with them at once. The story went, though the rumors were not precisely accurate either, that Ganya was very unlucky on this occasion too, seizing the opportunity after Varya had run off to the Yapankins to be alone with Aglaya. He had thought to broach the subject of his love. In spite of all her anguish and tears, Aglaya had burst out laughing as she listened and suddenly made him a strange proposition. Would he prove his love by burning his finger in the candle there and then? It was said that Ganya was dumbfounded by this proposal, and was so disconcerted and registered such bewilderment that Aglaya had burst into hysterical giggles at the sight and fled upstairs to Nina Alexandrovna, where her parents found her. This story reached the prince through Ippolit next day. Ippolit, now confined to bed, deliberately sent for the prince to pass on the news. How Ippolit had come to hear of it we do not know, but when the prince heard about the candle and the finger, he laughed so much that he surprised Ippolit. Then he suddenly began to tremble and dissolved in tears. Altogether, at that time he was in a state of considerable agitation and vague but agonizing distress. Ippolit bluntly declared that he considered him to be out of his mind, but that could not yet be said with any certainty. In presenting all these facts and refusing to explain them, we are by no means trying to justify our hero in the eyes of our readers. Moreover, we are quite willing to share the indignation he aroused against himself even among his friends. Even Vera Lebedeva was angry with him for some time, even Kolya was indignant, even Keller was too, until such time as he was chosen to be best man, not to mention Lebedev, who even began scheming against the prince, also out of a perfectly sincere indignation. But we will speak of that later. In general, Then, we are wholly in sympathy with certain forceful and psychologically profound remarks of Radomski's, which he made to the prince bluntly and without mincing words during a friendly conversation on the 6th or 7th day after the episode at Nastasia Filipovna's. We should mention, incidentally, that not only the Epankins themselves but everyone who had any connection with the Epankin household, either directly or indirectly, found it necessary to sever completely all relations with the prince. Princess, for example, even turned away on meeting the prince and refrained from returning his bow. But Radomski was not afraid of compromising himself by going to see the prince, despite the fact that he had begun to frequent the Epankin household again every day and was received with noticeably increased cordiality. He came to see the prince the day after all the Epankins had left Pavlovsk. When he entered, he was already aware of all the rumors that were circulating and might well have had some hand in assisting the process. The prince was terribly glad to see him and at once started talking about the Epankins. Such a direct and artless beginning put Yevgeny Pavlovich completely at his ease, so he came straight to the point without beating about the bush. The prince did not yet know that the Epankins had gone. He was startled and went pale. A minute later, however, he shook his head, bemused and thoughtful, and admitted it was to be expected. Then he quickly inquired where they had gone to. Yevgeny Pavlovich, meanwhile, was watching him closely. All of this, the swift series of ingenuous questions, the embarrassment coupled with an odd sort of candor, the agitation and excitability, all this surprised him a good deal. However, he told the prince everything in detail in a very amiable fashion. There was a lot the latter did not know, and Radomski was the first bearer of news from the Epankins. He confirmed that Aglaya really had been ill, that she had not slept for 3 days on end and had been running a high temperature, that she was feeling better now and out of all danger, though still in a nervous and hysterical condition. "It's a good thing there's perfect peace in the household," he said. "They try not to refer to the past at all, even among themselves, not just in Aglaya's presence. The parents have already talked between themselves about a trip abroad in the autumn. Straight after Adelaida's wedding, Aglaya said nothing when she heard the first mention of that. He, Radomski, would also go abroad, possibly. Even Princess intended to go for a month or 2 with Adelaida, if work permitted. The general himself would remain behind. They had all gone over to Kalmino, their estate about 15 miles out of Petersburg, where there was a large manor house. Princess Belakonskaya had not yet left for Moscow, and had apparently stayed behind deliberately. Lizaveta Prokofyevna had strongly insisted that it was impossible to remain in Pavlovsk after all that had happened. He, Yevgeny Pavlovich, had kept her informed every day about the rumors circulating in the town. They had not found it possible to go to their dacha on Yelagin Island either. "And really," added Radomski, "you have to admit, they could hardly have hung on, particularly when they knew everything that was going on in your house here all the time, and after your daily trips over there, despite being turned away." Yes, you're right. I wanted to see Aglaya Ivanovna." The prince nodded again. "Oh, my dear prince," exclaimed Yevgeny Pavlovich suddenly, with heartfelt sadness, "how could you have allowed all that to happen? Of course, it was all so unexpected for you. I agree, you were bound to lose your head and you certainly couldn't have stopped that mad girl, that was beyond your capabilities. But you must have realized, mustn't you, how intensely and seriously that girl felt towards you? She didn't want to share you with another woman, but you could throw away and smash a treasure like that." Yes, you're right, yes, it's my fault," the prince began again, in great anguish. "And you know, she was the only one, Aglaya was the only one who looked on Nastasia Filipovna in that light. Nobody else did they? But that's what makes all this so exasperating, that there was nothing serious in it, cried Yevgeny Pavlovitch, carried away in real earnest. I'm sorry, Prince, but I have been thinking. I've thought it over a lot. I know everything that took place earlier. I know all that happened 6 months ago, everything, and it was all to do with your head, not your heart, a figment, a fantasy, passing clouds. Only the frightened jealousy of a completely inexperienced girl could regard it as anything serious. At this point Yevgeny Pavlovitch, dispensing with the niceties altogether, gave full vent to his indignation. Clearly and sensibly and, we repeat, with great psychological insight, he unfolded before the prince the whole story of his former relationship with Nastasia Philippovna. Radomsky had always had a way with words, but now he rose to real eloquence. From the very start, he declared, it was a lie. What begins with a lie must end with a lie. That is a law of nature. I don't agree. In fact, I feel positively indignant when somebody, whoever it might be, calls you idiot. You are too intelligent for a name like that, but you are sufficiently odd, you must admit, not to be like other people. I have decided that the fundamental cause of what has happened is due in the first instance to your inherent inexperience, as it were, note the word inherent, Prince. Secondly, to your extraordinarily ingenuous nature. Thirdly, to a phenomenal lack of any sense of proportion, which you have admitted yourself several times, and lastly, to that enormous accretion of intellectual convictions which you, with that amazing honesty of yours, have hitherto taken to be genuine, natural, and spontaneous. You must admit, Prince, that in your relationship with Nastasia Philippovna from the very beginning there was something conventionally democratic, to put it shortly, some infatuation, so to speak, with the woman question, to put it even more briefly. You see, I know all the details of that strange and scandalous scene that took place at Nastasia Philippovna's when Rogozin brought his money. If you like, I'll analyze you to yourself, point by point. I'll show you to yourself in a mirror, so accurately do I know how it was and how it turned out the way it did. You, a young man in Switzerland, were homesick for your native country. You longed for Russia as an unknown but promised land. You read a lot of books about Russia, perhaps excellent books, but for you, pernicious, you arrived in the first flush of eagerness for action, so to speak, and flung yourself into it. And then, on your very first day, you are told the sad and heart-rending tale of a wronged woman, to you, a chaste knight-errant, and about a woman. The very same day you see the woman, you're captivated by her beauty, her fantastic, demonic beauty. I do agree she's a beautiful woman. Add to that your nervous state, your epilepsy, add in our Petersburg thawing weather, which can be such a shock to the system, add to it the whole of that day, in an unknown and to you almost fantastic city, a day of encounters and scenes, a day of unexpected acquaintances, the day of the 3 Yapankin beauties, among them Aglaya. Add to that fatigue, lightheadedness, Nastasia Philippovna's drawing room and the atmosphere there. And what else could you have expected of yourself at that moment, do you think? Yes, the prince was nodding his head, beginning to flush. That's almost how it was, you know. And do you know I really had hardly slept at all the night before, on the train, or the night before that either, and I was feeling very unsettled. Well, of course you were, that's what I'm trying to say, Yevgeny Pavlovitch pursued eagerly. Obviously intoxicated by the thrill of it all, so to speak, you clutched at the opportunity to proclaim publicly your noble-hearted notion, that as a prince of lineage and a man without stain, you did not regard a woman as dishonored who had been shamed by a disgusting high-society libertine and not through any fault of her own. Why heavens, of course it's understandable. But that's not the point, dear prince. The point is whether the emotion you experienced was genuine and authentic. Did it come from nature or was it simply a mental transport of enthusiasm? What do you think? The woman taken in adultery was forgiven, the same kind of woman, but she wasn't told she had done well, was she? That she was worthy of honor and esteem? Surely after 3 months your own common sense must have suggested to you what the real situation was? Suppose she is innocent now, I won't press the point as I don't wish to, but could all her adventures justify such intolerable demonic pride, such brazen, such voracious selfishness? I'm sorry, Prince, I'm getting carried away, but… Yes, all that may well be so, you may well be right, the prince began murmuring again, she really is very prone to anger of course, but… Deserving of compassion? That's what you mean to say, my soft-hearted prince? But for the sake of compassion and to satisfy her, how could you have put to shame another girl, high-minded and pure, and degrade her in those arrogant and hate-filled eyes? What lengths will compassion go to after that? Why, it's incredibly out of proportion. How could you, if you loved a girl, humiliate her in front of her rival, reject her in favor of the other, after you proposed to her yourself, and you did propose to her, didn't you? You told her in the presence of her parents and her sisters. After that, may I ask if you are an honorable man, Prince? And didn't you deceive that heavenly girl by telling her you loved her? Yes, you're right. Oh, I do feel it's my fault, said the prince, inexpressibly anguished. Is that really enough? Cried Yevgeny Pavlovitch indignantly. Is it really enough just to cry out, "Ah, I am to blame," and then persist in what you're doing? And where was your heart that time, your so Christian heart? You could see her face at that moment, couldn't you? Was she suffering less than the other one, your other woman, the one who has come between you? How could you see that and let it happen? How? But, you see I didn't, mumbled the wretched prince. What do you mean, you didn't? Honestly, I didn't let anything happen. I still don't know how it all came about. I did run after Aglaya Ivanovna, but Nastasia Philipovna fainted, and after that they won't let me see Aglaya. It doesn't matter. You should have run after Aglaya, even if the other one was lying in a faint. Yes, I should have, but she would have died. She would have killed herself, you don't know her, and, anyway, I'd have told Aglaya everything afterwards and… You see, Yevgeny Pavlovitch, I can see that apparently you don't know everything. Tell me why they won't let me in to see Aglaya? I would explain everything to her. You see, at the time neither of them were talking about what mattered, absolutely not, that's why things turned out as they did. I'm afraid I can't explain it to you at all, but I could have explained it to Aglaya, perhaps. Oh dear. You talk of her face at the moment she ran out, oh, heavens, I remember. Let's go. He tugged at Radomski's sleeve as he jumped up hurriedly from his chair. Where to? Let's go to Aglaya Ivanovna, let's go at once. But she's not in Pavlovsk, is she? I was telling you, and why go anyway? She'll understand, mumbled the prince, clasping his hands beseechingly. She'll understand that all this is beside the point, what matters is something quite different. Something quite different? But you are still getting married, aren't you? So you're persisting. Are you getting married or not? Oh yes. I'm getting married, yes, I am getting married. So how is it beside the point? Oh no, that's what it is, that's just what it is. It doesn't matter, my getting married, that means nothing. What do you mean it doesn't matter and it doesn't mean anything? It's hardly a trifle, is it? You're marrying a woman you love, to make her happy, and Aglaya Ivanovna sees that and knows it, so how can it not matter? Happy? Oh no! I'm just getting married, she wants that, and what does it matter if I do? But it's all of no consequence. She would certainly have died, that's all. I can see now that her marrying Rogozin was madness. I realize now what I didn't before, and you see, when they were both standing facing each other, I couldn't bear to see Nastasia Philippovna's face. You don't know, Yevgeny Pavlovich, he lowered his voice mysteriously, I've never told this to anyone, never, not even Aglaya, but I cannot bear Nastasia Philippovna's face. You were right just now when you were talking about that evening at Nastasia Philippovna's, but there was one other thing you missed, because you don't know about it, I was looking at her face. Even that morning, looking at her portrait, I couldn't bear it. Now Vera Lebedeva, has quite different eyes, I'm afraid of her face, he added, greatly terrified. Afraid? Yes, she's mad, he whispered, ashen pale. You're sure about that? Asked Yevgeny Pavlovich with keen curiosity. Yes, I am, now I'm really sure, now, over these last days, I've found out for certain. Then what are you doing to yourself? Cried Yevgeny Pavlovich in alarm. You mean you're getting married out of fear of some kind? It's absolutely incomprehensible. Not even loving her, I dare say? Oh, no, I love her with all my soul. You see, she's an absolute child. Oh, you just don't know. And at the same time you were assuring Aglaya of your love? Oh yes, yes. But how? You mean you want to love both of them? Oh yes, yes. Please, Prince, think what you're saying, do come to your senses. Without Aglaya. I simply have to see her. I shall soon die in my sleep, I thought I was going to do it last night. Oh, if only Aglaya were to know everything, absolutely everything, I mean. What matters here is to know everything. Why can't we ever know everything about another person, when we ought to, when that other person is to blame? Really, I don't know what I'm saying, I'm all muddled up, you've shaken me terribly. Surely her face can't be the same now as when she ran out? Oh yes, I'm to blame. I'm most probably to blame for everything. I still don't know what for, but I'm to blame. There's something involved here which I cannot explain to you, Yevgeny Pavlovich, and I don't have the words, but Aglaya would understand. Oh, I always believed she would understand. No, Prince, she wouldn't. Aglaya Ivanovna loved you like a woman, a human being, not like some disembodied spirit. Look here, my poor Prince, most probably you've never loved either of them. I don't know, perhaps, you're right about many things, Yevgeny Pavlovich. Oh, my head is starting to ache again, let's go to her. For God's sake, for God's sake. But I'm telling you, aren't I, she isn't in Pavlovsk, she's in Kalmino. Let's go to Kalmino, then, straight away. It's impossible, drawled Yevgeny Pavlovich, getting to his feet. Listen, I'll write a letter, take a letter for me. No, Prince, no. Spare me such commissions, I can't do it. They parted. Radomski left with some odd impressions. In his opinion, too, the prince was not entirely in control of his faculties. And what did this face mean, that he was so much afraid of, and yet so loved? At the same time, he might actually die without Aglaya, so that perhaps Aglaya would never know he loved her so much.
Ah.
And what was that about loving two of them? Two different kinds of love somehow? That was interesting, poor idiot. And what would become of him now? 10. The prince, however, did not die before his wedding, awake or in his sleep as he had predicted to Radomski. Perhaps he really did sleep poorly and have bad dreams, but during the day, in the company of other people, he appeared kindly and even content. At times he was somewhat pensive, but that was when he was alone. The arrangements for the wedding proceeded apace. It was fixed for a week or so after Yevgeny Pavlovich's visit. In view of such haste, even the prince's best friends, if he had any such, must have despaired of their efforts to save the foolish wretch. It was rumored that General Yupankin and his wife, Lizaveta Prokofievna, were partly responsible for Yevgeny Pavlovich's visit. But even had they both desired, out of the limitless goodness of their hearts, to rescue the pitiful madman from the abyss, they were bound of course to restrict themselves to this feeble attempt. Any more serious attempt would not have been appropriate to their position, nor even perhaps to their heart's inclination, naturally enough. We have mentioned that even those closest to the prince had, to some extent, turned against him. Vera Lebedeva, however, confined herself to solitary weeping and stayed more in her part of the house, looking in on the prince less frequently than before. Kolya, meanwhile, was occupied with his father's funeral. The old man had died from a second stroke, about a week after the first. The prince had participated fully in the family mourning, and in the first few days spent several hours at a time with Nina Alexandrovna. He was at the funeral and the church service. Many people noticed that the church congregation couldn't help whispering at the prince's arrival and departure. The same thing happened in the street and the park. Whenever he walked or drove by, conversation would well up, his name would be mentioned, people would point, Nastasia Filipovna's name would be heard. People looked out for her at the funeral too, but she was not there. The captain's widow was not there either, Lebedev having succeeded in catching her in time and preventing her from coming. The funeral service made a powerful and painful impression on the prince. He whispered to Lebedev while still in the church, in answer to some query of his, that it was the first time he had attended an Orthodox funeral service, and the only other such service he could recall had been in some country church when he had been a child. "Yes, sir, it doesn't seem to be the same man in the coffin that we chose to be our chairman not so long ago, remember, sir?" Lebedev hissed to the prince. "Who are you looking for, sir?" "It's nothing, I just thought, not Rogozin?" "He's not here, is he?" "In the church, sir." "That's why I thought I saw his eyes," muttered the prince, perturbed. "But why is he here? Was he invited?" "They never thought of it, sir. They don't know him at all, sir. All sorts of people are here, sir, the public, sir. Why are you so surprised? I often meet him nowadays. I've run across him 3 or 4 times in the last week here in Pavlovsk." "I've never once seen him since that time," muttered the prince. Since Nastasia Filipovna had also not once mentioned meeting Rogozin since that time, the prince concluded that Rogozin was keeping himself out of sight for some reason. All that day he was plunged in thought. Nastasia Filipovna, on the other hand, was unusually cheerful all that day and evening. Kolya, who had been reconciled with the prince before his father's death, suggested he choose Keller and Berdovsky to assist at the ceremony, as the matter was vital and pressing. He could vouch for Keller's behaving properly, adding that he might come in handy. There was no difficulty about Berdovsky, who was a quiet and unassuming individual. Nina. Alexandrovna and Lebedev kept pointing out to the prince that, if the wedding was indeed decided upon, then why have it in Pavlovsk, at the height of the fashionable holiday season, why so public? Would it not be better in Petersburg, or even at the house? The prince knew perfectly well what prompted all these misgivings, but responded briefly and simply, that such was Nastasia Philippovna's express wish. The next day Keller came to see the prince, after being informed that he was to be best man. Before entering, he halted in the doorway and, as soon as he saw the prince, raised his right hand with the index finger away from the rest, as if taking a vow, and cried, "I won't drink." Then he went up to the prince, squeezed and shook both hands firmly, and announced that when he had first heard of the wedding he was against it, of course, and had declared as much over billiards, and for no other reason than that he had hoped and waited daily, with a friend's impatience, for him to marry a Princess de Rohan, no less. But now he could see for himself that the prince's view of things was at least 10 times as high-minded as the rest of them put together. Because what he wanted was not glitter, not riches, not even honor, but simply the truth. The sympathies of exalted persons were very well known, but the prince, because of his education, was too exalted not to be an exalted person himself, taking it all in all. But the rabble and various sorts of riffraff look at it differently, in the town, in the houses, at the assemblies, in the villas, at the music, in the taverns and billiard halls. All the talk and shouting is of nothing else but the forthcoming event. I've heard they even want to organize a tin pan serenade under your windows, and that on your, so to speak, first night. If you need the pistol of an honorable man, Prince, I'm ready to exchange a good half-dozen shots of honor before you rise the morning after from your honeymoon couch. He also counseled the prince to have a fire hose ready in the yard, in the event of a sizable invasion of drythroats after the church ceremony. Lebedev had opposed this, however. If you turn the fire hose on them, says he, they'll smash the house to matchwood. This Lebedev is scheming against you, Prince, I swear he is. They want you put under legal restraint, if you can imagine such a thing, involving everything, your freedom of action and your money, the two things that distinguish every one of us from the quadrupeds. I've heard it for a fact. It's the honest truth. The prince recalled having already heard something of the sort himself, but had ignored it, of course. Now, too, he merely burst out laughing and forgot about it immediately. Lebedev really had been active for some time. The man's calculations were invariably conceived as the fruit of inspiration and, out of an excess of zeal, grew steadily more complicated and ramified as they spread away in all directions from their original starting point. That is why he had had so little success in life. When, almost on the wedding day, he came along to the prince to confess his guilt, it was his invariable habit to come and confess his guilt to those against whom he had been scheming, particularly if he had been unsuccessful. He declared that he had been born at Talleyrand but for some unaccountable reason had remained a mere Lebedev. He then proceeded to disclose his entire strategy, at the same time intriguing the prince enormously. According to him, he had started out by seeking the good offices of highly placed persons, on whom he could depend in case of need, and had gone to see General Yapankin. The general was much perplexed. He wished the young man well, but stated that, despite his willingness to save him, it would be improper for him to act in the matter. Lizaveta Prokofievna wished neither to see nor to listen to him. Radomsky and Princess simply waved him away. Lebedev, however, had not lost heart, and consulted a certain shrewd lawyer, a venerable old man, a good friend and quasi-benefactor to him. The latter concluded that the business was perfectly feasible, provided that competent people could be found to testify to the prince's mental derangement and undoubted insanity, with the involvement of eminent persons to lend their support. this last being the most important thing. Even this did not dampen Lebedev's spirits, and he went so far as to fetch a doctor, a villa resident, along to the prince on one occasion. Another worthy old gentleman, with the saint and ribbon, he was to spy out the land, so to speak, make the prince's acquaintance, and let him, Lebedev, know what his conclusion was, not officially for the moment, but as a friend, so to speak. The prince recalled the doctor's visit. He remembered Lebedev kept telling him the day before that he looked unwell, and when the prince refused any treatment he had suddenly appeared with the doctor, under the pretext that they had both just come from Mr. Terentiev, who was very poorly, and that the doctor had something to tell the prince about the sick man. The prince thanked Lebedev and greeted the doctor with the utmost geniality. They at once got talking about Ippolit's illness, and the doctor asked the prince for a detailed account of the suicide scene. The prince utterly captivated him with his description and interpretation of the incident. They went on to talk about the Petersburg climate, the prince's own illness, about Switzerland, and about Schneider. The doctor became so interested in the prince's stories and his description of Schneider's system of treatment that he sat there for 2 hours, smoking the prince's excellent cigars. Lebedev, for his part, regaled them with a most delicious liqueur, which Vera brought in. Here the doctor, a married man with a family, began paying her such high-flown compliments that he provoked her intense indignation. They parted friends. As he was leaving, the doctor informed Lebedev that if every such person was placed under restraint, who on earth would be left to do the supervising? In answer to Lebedev's tragic account of the forthcoming marriage, the doctor wagged his head, knowingly roguish, and remarked at length that, leaving aside the fact that there's no knowing who will marry whom, the seductive creature, at least as far as he had heard tell, apart from her matchless beauty, which might of itself attract a man of fortune, possessed means of her own from Totsky and Rogozin, pearls and diamonds, shawls and furniture, so that the dear prince's choice, so far from being, as it were, evidence of any outstanding foolishness, rather testified to a shrewd and calculating worldly intelligence. It therefore pointed to the opposite conclusion, one highly favorable to the prince. This idea had impressed Lebedev as well. That was the end result of his labors, and now, he added to the prince, now, you will see nothing from me, apart from devotion and the readiness to shed my blood. That is what I came to tell you. Ippolit too helped to take the prince's mind off things during these last days. He sent for him on many occasions. The family was living in a little house close by. At least the little children, Ippolit's brother and sister, were glad of the country existence, because they could escape from their ailing brother into the garden. His poor mother, however, was always at his beck and call and had no life with him. It was the prince's task to separate and pacify them every day, and the sick man went on calling him Nanny, at the same time, apparently, not daring to despise him for his role as peacemaker. He had a considerable grievance against Kolya for hardly coming to see him of late, first staying by the side of his dying father, and then with his widowed mother. At length he made the prince's imminent marriage to Nastasia Philippovna the target of his sneers, ending up by offending the prince and eventually causing him to lose his temper. The prince stopped visiting him. 2 days later, Ippolit's mother came trailing along in the morning and tearfully beseeched the prince to visit them, otherwise he would eat her alive. She added that he wanted to disclose a great secret. The prince went. Ippolit wanted to make it up and started crying, but after the tears, of course, he was more spiteful than ever, though afraid to give vent to his ill humor. He was very ill and all the signs indicated that he would now soon die. There was no secret at all, apart from intense appeals, gasping with emotion so to speak, perhaps put on, to beware of Rogozin. He's the sort of man who will never give up what is his. We're no match for a man like him, Prince. If he wants something he wouldn't bat an eyelid, and so on and so forth. The prince began questioning him further, trying to elicit some facts, but there were no facts beyond Ippolit's own feelings and impressions. To his own immense gratification, Ippolit ended up by scaring the prince thoroughly. At first the prince refused to answer some of his peculiar questions, and only smiled at his advice to run away, abroad if necessary. "There are Russian priests everywhere," Ippolit went on, "and you can get married there." But at length Ippolit concluded with the following thought: "The only person I'm afraid for is Aglaya. Rogozin knows how much you love her, a love for a love you've taken. Nastasia Philippovna away from him and he'll kill Aglaya Ivanovna. She's not yours now, of course, but it would be a heavy blow for you, wouldn't it?" He had achieved his object. The prince left with his mind in turmoil. These warnings about Rogozin came on the day before the wedding. That evening, the prince saw Nastasia Philippovna for the last time before the ceremony. She, however, was in no mood to reassure him, on the contrary. Recently she had been making him more and more distraught. Before that, several days earlier that is, she had done all she could to cheer him up during their meetings and greatly feared his mournful looks. She even tried singing to him. Above all, she tried recounting to him every funny story she could think of. The prince almost always pretended to be vastly amused, and indeed he did occasionally laugh at her brilliant wit and the vivacious manner of the telling when she was carried away by the subject, as she often was. Seeing the prince laugh, and seeing the effect she had on him, she would go into ecstasies and begin to feel proud of herself. But these last days, her musing sadness intensified almost by the hour. His opinions about Nastasia Philippovna's state were by now firmly fixed, otherwise everything about her would have seemed to him puzzling and incomprehensible. But he genuinely believed that she could still recover. He had been perfectly truthful when he had told Radomski that he loved her genuinely and wholeheartedly, and his love for her really did contain the kind of bond one has with some pitiful, ailing child whom it is difficult, if not impossible, to leave to its own devices. He had never explained his feelings for her to anyone, unless it was inescapable. When he was alone with Nastasia Philippovna they never spoke of their feelings, it was as if they had agreed not to do so. Anyone could participate in their normal, cheerful, and lively conversation. Darya Alexeyevna used to say afterwards that all this time she did nothing but marvel and be glad, just looking at them. But it was this view he had of Nastasia Philippovna's spiritual and mental state which relieved him to some extent of many another perplexity. Now she was a totally different woman from the one he had known 3 months before. He no longer brooded, for example, over why she had run away from marrying him back then, with tears, imprecations and reproaches, and was now herself insisting on having the wedding as soon as possible. She mustn't be afraid any longer, as she was then. That marriage to me would mean my ruin, thought the prince. Such a swiftly restored self-confidence could not, to his way of thinking, be natural to her. It couldn't simply have arisen out of her hatred for Aglaya alone. Nastasia Philippovna was capable of feeling more deeply than that. Could it stem from her fear of a future with Rogozin? In fact, all those reasons together with others might have contributed to it, but what was most obvious to him was what he had suspected for a long time, that her poor, sick mind had given way. All this, though it did in a way save him from worrying about other possibilities, could not give him rest or peace of mind throughout this period. Sometimes he seemed to try not to think about anything. He certainly regarded his marriage as a sort of minor formality. He felt little concern about his own future. As for objections and discussions like the one with Radomski, he would most certainly have been unable to answer them, and felt himself totally incompetent to do so, and for that reason he steered clear of any discussion of that sort. Still, he did observe that Nastasia Philippovna knew and understood very well what Aglaya had meant to him. She didn't say anything, but he saw her face at times when she came across him at the very beginning, getting ready to go to the Epankins. When the Epankins left, she was literally radiant. However unobservant and lacking in intuition he might have been, the idea had begun to nag at him that Nastasia Philippovna would make her mind up to create some sort of scandalous scene, in order to drive Aglaya out of Pavlovsk. The uproar and commotion among the villas about the wedding was to some extent kept going by Nastasia Philippovna herself in order to exasperate her rival. Since it was difficult actually to meet the Epankins, Nastasia Philippovna on one occasion had sat the prince in her carriage and given orders for him to be driven past the very windows of their villa. This had been a dreadful surprise for the prince. As usual, he had realized what was going on too late to avert it, and the carriage was already driving past the windows. He had said nothing, but was ill for 2 days afterwards. Nastasia Philippovna did not repeat the experiment. In the final days before the wedding she was beginning to brood a great deal. She always ended by overcoming her melancholy mood and recovering her cheerfulness, but was somehow more subdued, not so noisy, not so happily cheerful as she had been before, not so long ago. The prince redoubled his attentiveness. He found it curious that she would never speak to him about Rogozin. Just once, about 5 days before the wedding, Daria Alexeyevna sent for him to come at once as Nastasia Philippovna was feeling very unwell. He found her in a state bordering on complete derangement. She was crying out, shuddering, shouting that Rogozin was hiding in the garden of their house, that she had just now seen him, and that he was going to kill her in the night, cut her throat. She was unable to calm down all day. But that same evening, when the prince had dropped in to see Ippolit for a minute or two, his mother, the captain's widow, who had just returned from town after attending to some small matters of her own, told him that Rogozin had called at her flat that day and questioned her about Pavlovsk. In response to the prince's question, she said that Rogozin had been there at virtually the same time when he was supposed to have been seen by Nastasia Philippovna in the garden. The whole business was therefore a simple case of imagining things. Nastasia Philippovna went to see the captain's widow herself to inquire in more detail, and was greatly reassured. On the eve of the wedding the prince left Nastasia Philippovna in a great flutter. Her finery for the morrow had arrived from the Petersburg dressmakers, the bridal gown, the veil, and so on. The prince had not anticipated that she would be so excited by the garments. For his part, he praised everything and that made her happier still. But she did let something slip. She had already heard that there was indignation in the town and that some scallywags were going to organize a tin pan serenade, with music and possibly even verses specially composed for the occasion, and that this more or less had the support of the rest of the townsfolk. Thus it was that now she was even keener to hold her head high before them and eclipse them all with the splendor and style of her wedding finery. Let them shout all they like, let them whistle if they dare. The mere idea made her eyes sparkle. She also cherished one more secret dream, but did not speak it aloud. She hoped that Aglaya, or at least some emissary of hers, would be in the throng, incognito, in the church, and would be watching and noting everything. She was inwardly preparing herself for that. She parted from the prince, much exercised by these and similar thoughts, at about 11 in the evening. Midnight had not yet struck, however, when a messenger from Daria Alexandrovna came hotfoot to the prince, asking him to come as fast as he could. It was very bad. The prince found his bride locked in her bedroom in floods of tears and hysterical despair. For a long time she could hear nothing said to her through the locked door, but she finally opened it to admit just the prince, then closed it after him and fell on her knees before him. Such, at least, was the story Daria Alexeyevna, who had contrived to catch a glimpse, gave out later. "What am I doing? What am I doing? What am I doing to you?" she cried out, embracing his legs convulsively. The prince sat with her for a whole hour. We don't know what they talked about. Daria Alexeyevna said that they parted an hour later, reconciled and happy. The prince sent again to inquire after her during the night, but Nastasia Philippovna was asleep by then. In the morning, before she woke, 2 more messengers arrived at Daria Alexeyevna's, and a third was instructed to convey to the prince that Nastasia Philippovna was surrounded by a veritable swarm of dressmakers and hairstylists from Petersburg, that there was no sign of the previous night's alarms, that she was busy with her toilet as only a beauty like her could be on her wedding morning, and that at this very moment a grave conference was taking place about which of her diamonds she should wear and how best they should be displayed. The prince was completely reassured. The whole of the succeeding account was given by people present at the wedding, and appears to be accurate. The ceremony was due to take place at 8 in the evening. Nastasia Philippovna was ready by 7. Since as early as 6 o'clock, gaping crowds had gradually started congregating around Lebedev's villa, but more particularly near Daria Alexeyevna's house. From 7 onwards the church too began filling up. Vera Lebedeva and Kolya were extremely concerned on the prince's account. However, they had a good many chores to see to at home. They were organizing the reception and hospitality arrangements in the prince's rooms. In fact, nothing much in the way of a reception was planned for after the ceremony. In addition to the essential people who were assisting at the ceremony, Lebedev had invited the Titsins, Ganya, the saint and doctor, and Daria Alexeyevna. When the prince inquired of Lebedev why he had thought to invite the doctor, whom he hardly knew, Lebedev replied complacently, "He wears a decoration, a respectable man, sir, for the look of the thing, sir," and made the prince laugh. Keller and Berdovsky looked very smart in their evening dress and gloves, but Keller still worried the prince and his well-wishers by a certain unconcealed readiness to do battle, as he regarded the onlookers who had gathered near the house with considerable hostility. Finally, at 7:30, the prince set off in his carriage for the church. We should observe, incidentally, that the prince made a deliberate point of abiding by all the accepted ceremonies and customs. Everything was done properly, out in the open for all to see. Inside the church, having somehow or other made his way through the crowd amid ceaseless whispering and comments from the public, the prince, escorted by Keller, who was glowering menacingly to right and left, concealed himself temporarily in the sanctuary. Keller set off to fetch the bride, where, by the porch of Daria Alexeyevna's house, he found a gathering not only 2 or 3 times as numerous as at the prince's but perhaps 3 times as free and easy. As he went up the porch steps, he heard such comments that he could no longer restrain himself, and was about to address the public in appropriate language when he was fortunately prevented by Berdovsky and Daria Alexeyevna herself, who ran down from the porch and dragged him inside by main force. Keller was irritable and in a hurry. Nastasia Philippovna rose, glanced at herself in the mirror, remarked with a wry smile, as Keller later recounted, that she was as pale as death, bowed reverently before the icon, and went out onto the porch. A hubbub of voices greeted her appearance. True, there was some initial laughter, applause, and something like hissing, but in an instant other voices were raised. "How beautiful she is," came from some in the crowd. "She's not the first, and she won't be the last." "A wedding ring hushes everything up, fools." "No, try finding a beauty like that anywhere, hurrah," cried those in front. "A princess! I'd sell my soul for a princess like that," shouted some clerk. "My life for just one night," he sang. Nastasia Philippovna was certainly as white as a sheet when she emerged, but her great black eyes blazed out at the crowd like burning coals. The crowd could not withstand a look like that. Their indignation turned to rapturous shouting. The carriage doors were already opened and Keller had already offered the bride his arm, when she suddenly screamed and rushed straight down from the porch into the throng. All those accompanying her froze in astonishment. The crowd parted before her, and half a dozen paces from the porch appeared Rogozin. It was his eye among the crowd that Nastasia Philippovna had caught. She ran to him like a mad thing and seized both his hands. "Save me! Take me away! Wherever you like now!" Rogozin took her in his arms and almost lifted her into the carriage. In an instant, he took out a 100-ruble note from his purse and proffered it to the coachman. "The railway station, and if we're on time, there's another 100 in it for you." Then he sprang into the carriage after Nastasia Philippovna and closed the doors. The coachman didn't hesitate for an instant and lashed his horses forward. Keller afterwards blamed the unexpectedness of it all. "Another second and I'd have recovered my wits and stopped them," he explained when recounting the incident. He and Burdovsky were about to take another carriage which chanced to be standing there and hurtle off in pursuit, but had second thoughts, as it was too late in any case. "We couldn't very well bring her back by force. And the prince wouldn't want that either," decided a stunned Burdovsky. Meanwhile, Rogozin and Nastasia Philippovna reached the station in time. As he got out of the carriage and was about to board the train, Rogozin managed to stop a girl wearing an old but presentable dark shawl and a silk kerchief over her hair. "50 due for the shawl?" He suddenly held out money to the girl. Before she had time to be astonished or realize what was happening, he had thrust the 50 rubles into her hand, removed the shawl and kerchief, and thrown them over Nastasia Philippovna's head and shoulders. Her magnificent gown was too conspicuous and would have arrested everyone's attention on the train. Only afterwards did the girl realize why her old rags had been purchased at so much profit to herself. News of the incident was noised abroad and reached the church with extraordinary rapidity. When Keller was making his way through to the prince, great numbers of total strangers rushed up to question him. A loud hubbub of voices rose, with wagging of heads and even laughter. No one left the church, everyone was waiting to see how the groom would take the news. He turned pale, but received the news quietly enough, saying in a barely audible voice, "I was afraid it might happen, but I didn't think it would," all the same, adding after a pause, still, in her state of mind, "It might well have been expected." Keller himself later described the comment as unprecedented philosophy. The prince left the church, apparently calm and in good spirits. That, at any rate, is what many people observed and afterwards recounted. He seemed very anxious to get home and be alone as soon as possible. This, however, was denied him. Several of those invited followed him in, among them Titsyn, Ganya, and the doctor, who also had no plans to leave. Besides which, the whole house was literally besieged by a festive crowd. Even from the veranda the prince caught the sound of Keller and Lebedev commencing a fierce argument with several complete strangers, respectable-looking people who were determined at all costs to reach the veranda. The prince went up to the disputants, inquired what was the matter, politely dismissed Lebedev and Keller, and tactfully addressed a stout, gray-haired gentleman standing on the steps at the head of a number of other desirous individuals, inviting him to do him the honor of paying him a visit. The gentleman sheepishly did so, followed by another and a third. Out of the whole crowd, about 7 or 8 people came in, trying to appear as much at ease as they were able. No more volunteers came forward, and the crowd even started criticizing the intruders. The newcomers were seated, and conversation got underway as tea was served. All of this was done very decorously and modestly, to the surprise of the newcomers. There were attempts made, of course, to enliven the talk and turn it towards the topic of the moment. Several tactless questions were asked and a few pointed remarks passed. The prince answered everyone so simply and genially, and at the same time with such dignity and faith in the integrity of his guests, that the indiscreet questions subsided of themselves. Gradually the conversation took an almost grave turn. One gentleman, picking up someone else's remark, vowed with great indignation that he would not sell his property whatever happened, he would wait and see. Business assets are better than money. There, sir, is my economic system, and I don't care who knows it. Since he was addressing his remarks to the prince, the latter warmly applauded him, despite Lebedev whispering in his ear that the gentleman had neither house nor home and had never possessed an estate of any sort. Almost an hour had passed, the tea had been drunk, and after that the guests began to feel embarrassed at staying any longer. The doctor and the grey-headed man said a cordial goodbye to the prince, and indeed they all took their leave cordially and noisily. Good wishes were expressed and opinions passed to the effect that it was no use crying over spilt milk, perhaps it was all for the best, and so forth. True, there were attempts made to request champagne, but the older guests restrained the younger ones. When they had all gone, Keller leaned over to Lebedev and said, "You and I would have had a shouting match, got into a fight, disgraced ourselves, and had the police brought in, but here he's made some new friends, and what friends? I know them." Lebedev, who was well primed, sighed, and said, "Thou hast hidden these things from the wise and prudent and vouchsafed them to babes." I've said that before about him, but I'm adding now that God has preserved the babe himself, saved him from the abyss, he and all his saints. At last, around 10:30, the prince was left alone. He had a headache. Kolya had been the last to leave after helping the prince change out of his wedding clothes into his everyday garments. They parted very affectionately. Kolya did not talk much about what had happened, but promised to call early on the following day. He testified later that at their last parting, the prince had not forewarned him of anything, so must have been concealing his intentions even from him. Soon there was almost no one left in the house. Burdovsky had gone to Ippolit's. Keller and Lebedev had also set off somewhere. Only Vera Lebedeva remained for a little while in his rooms, hurriedly setting everything to rights after the reception. As she left, she glanced into the prince's room. He was seated at the table leaning his elbows on it, his head buried in his hands. She went softly up to him and touched him on the shoulder. The prince looked at her bemusedly and spent almost a minute apparently trying to recall something. Once he had done so and it had all sunk in, he suddenly became extremely agitated. All he did, however, was to implore Vera earnestly to knock on his door the following morning at 7 o'clock, as soon as the train started running. She promised to do so. The prince began begging her earnestly not to tell anyone about it. She promised again, and when at length she opened the door to leave he stopped her for the third time, took her hands, kissed them, then kissed her on the forehead and, with a sort of peculiar expression, uttered the words, "Till tomorrow." This was Vera's account afterwards at any rate. She left greatly concerned about him. Next morning she felt somewhat more cheerful when she knocked on his door a little after 7 as arranged, and informed him that the Petersburg train would be leaving in a quarter of an hour. When he opened the door she thought he looked perfectly cheerful and even smiling. He had hardly undressed that night, however, he had slept. He thought he might be coming back that day. It would appear, therefore, that she was the only person he had considered it possible and necessary to tell, at that moment, that he was setting off for town. 11. An hour later he was already in Petersburg, and was ringing at Rogozin's house sometime after 9. He went in by the main entrance, and for a long time no one opened the door. At length the door of Rogozin's old mother opened and a pleasant-faced old maidservant appeared. "Parfen Semyonovich is not at home," she announced from the doorway. "Who is it you want?" "Parfen Semyonovich." "He's not at home, sir." The maid was regarding him with intense curiosity. "At least tell me whether he spent the night at home. And, did he come back alone last night?" The maid kept on staring at him, but made no reply. "Wasn't Nastasia Philippovna here with him yesterday evening? May I inquire, sir, who you may be yourself?" "Prince Lev Nikolaevich Mishkin, we know one another very well." "He's not at home, sir." The maid dropped her eyes. "And Nastasia Philippovna?" "I don't know about that, sir." Wait. When will he be back?" "I don't know that either, sir." The door closed. The prince decided to return in an hour. Glancing into the courtyard, he encountered the porter. "Is Parfen Semyonovich in?" "Yes, sir." "Then why was I told just now he was out? Did his servant tell you that?" "No, the mother's maid. I rang Parfen Semyonovich's bell, but nobody answered." "Perhaps he has gone out then," decided the porter. "He doesn't say, sir, you know. Sometimes he takes the key with him and the flat stays locked for 3 days." "You're certain he was at home yesterday?" "Yes, he was. Sometimes he uses the front entrance though, and you don't see him." "Nastasia Philippovna wasn't with him yesterday, was she?" "That I don't know, sir. She doesn't come visiting often, at that. Think I'd have known if she'd come." The prince left and spent some time walking the pavement sunk in thought. The windows of Rogozin's rooms were all shut, the windows of his mother's flat were all open. It was a hot and sunny day. The prince crossed the street onto the opposite pavement and stopped to look again at the windows. Not only were they closed, but white curtains were drawn almost everywhere. He stood for a moment and strangely enough, all of a sudden, he thought he saw a corner of one of the curtains being lifted and for a moment caught a fleeting glimpse of Rogozin's face, one fleeting glimpse, then it vanished instantly. He waited for a while and was on the point of going over and ringing again, but changed his mind and postponed it for an hour. Who knows, perhaps I just imagined it. What decided him was that he was in a hurry to get to the Izmailovsky regiment district, to the flat Nastasia Philippovna had occupied recently. He knew that, when she had left Pavlovsk at his request 3 weeks previously, she had gone to live with an old friend of hers, a schoolmaster's widow, a respectable woman with a family, who rented out a well-furnished room and virtually lived on the proceeds. Most likely, Nastasia Philippovna had kept the flat on after moving to Pavlovsk. At any rate, it was perfectly conceivable that she had spent the night there, where Rogozin, of course, had brought her the previous evening. The prince took a cab. On the way it occurred to him that he should have started here in any case, as it was highly unlikely that she had gone straight to Rogozin's that night. Now the porter's words came back to him too, that Nastasia Philippovna did not often go there. If she didn't go there often in any case, why should she be staying with Rogozin now? Cheering himself with reflections of this kind, he arrived in Izmailovsky at length, in a state of fearful anxiety. To his absolute amazement, no one at the widow's had heard of Nastasia Philippovna either that day or the previous one, but they all ran out to peer at him as if he were some sort of prodigy. All the widow's numerous family, all 8 girls from 7 to 15, spilled out after their mother and surrounded him, open-mouthed. Behind them came a gaunt, sallow aunt in a black kerchief, and finally the grandmother put in an appearance, a little old lady in spectacles. The widow earnestly requested him to go in and sit down, which he accordingly did. He realized at once that they were perfectly well aware of who he was and knew that his wedding should have taken place the day before. They were dying to ask him both about the wedding and the extraordinary fact that he was inquiring about the woman who should have been nowhere else but with him in Pavlovsk, but were too tactful to mention it. He briefly satisfied their curiosity about the wedding. There followed a chorus of astonishment, cries and groans, so that he felt obliged to tell them practically everything else, in broad terms of course. At length the advice of the sage and agitated ladies was that he should first of all knock up Rogozin and find out definitely what was going on. If he was really not at home, which he must ascertain, or refuse to say anything, then he must go to the Semyonovsky quarter and see a German lady, a friend of Nastasia Philippovna who lived with her mother. Perhaps, in her excitement and anxiety to conceal herself, she might have spent the night with them. The prince got up feeling absolutely crushed. They said afterwards that he had gone terribly pale, indeed, his legs were almost giving way. At length, through the terrific babble of voices, he made out that they were agreeing among themselves to act in his interest and were asking him for his address in town. As it turned out that he didn't have one, they advised him to put up at a hotel. The prince thought for a moment and gave them the address of his former hotel, the one where he had had his seizure some 5 weeks previously. After that he set off for Rogozin's again. This time not only Rogozin's door but even that of his mother remained shut. The prince went down to seek out the porter and found him, after some difficulty, in the yard. The porter was busy with some task and would barely answer him, or even look at him, but he did announce positively that Rogozin had gone out very early that morning, to Pavlovsk, and would not be back that day. "I'll wait, perhaps he'll be back this evening? And perhaps not for a week, who can tell? So he must have spent the night here, then?" Spent the night, yes indeed. All of this was suspicious and sinister. It was highly likely that the porter had had time to get fresh instructions in the meantime. Earlier, he had been quite talkative, but now he simply turned his back. Still, the prince decided to call again in a couple of hours and even keep watch on the house if necessary. Now there remained the hope of the German lady, and he set off post-haste for the Semyonovsky regiment district. But at the German ladies they didn't even understand him. Gleaning a few words here and there, he was able to gather that about a fortnight previously, the beautiful German lady had quarreled violently with Nastasia Philippovna, and so had heard nothing of her, even if she had married all the princes in the world. The prince left hastily. It had crossed his mind, meanwhile, that she might have gone to Moscow as before, and Rogozin of course after her, or perhaps with her. At least let me find some trace of her. He remembered, however, that he had to stay in some hotel, so he hurried off to Lithuania, where he found a room at once. The servant inquired if he would like something to eat. He replied absently that he would, then, recollecting himself, was furious because the meal delayed him half an hour, and it was only afterwards that he realized that nothing had prevented him leaving untouched what they brought him. An odd feeling possessed him in that dim and stuffy corridor, a sensation that strove tantalizingly to take the form of thought, but he just could not grasp what the insistent notion was. He emerged from the hotel at last, feeling dizzy and thoroughly out of sorts. But where could he go now? He rushed round to Rogozin's again. Rogozin had not returned, No one answered the bell. He rang the old mother. The door was opened and he was informed that Parfen Semyonovich was not at home and might not be back for 3 days or more. It disturbed the prince that, as before, he was scrutinized with such avid curiosity. On this occasion the porter was nowhere to be found. As he had done earlier, he crossed over to the opposite pavement, looked at the windows, and walked about in the stifling heat for half an hour or more. This time nothing stirred, the windows had not been opened, the white curtains were motionless. He came to the definite conclusion that he had been imagining things earlier. It was obvious that the windows were so grimy and long unwashed that it would have been hard to make out even if someone actually did peer through the panes. Cheered by this reflection, he drove back to the widows in Izmailovsky. They were already expecting him there. The widow had been to 3 or 4 places, and had even called in at Rogozin's. No trace. The prince listened in silence, went in, sat down on the sofa, and began looking at them, seemingly unable to understand what they were talking about. It was odd, one moment he was sharply observant, the next he would become incredibly absent-minded. The whole family stated later that he was an astonishingly strange person that day, so that perhaps all the signs were there already. He finally got to his feet and asked them to show him Nastasia Philippovna's rooms. These were 2 spacious, light, high-ceilinged rooms, very decently furnished and not cheap. All these ladies said afterwards that the prince went round examining every object in the rooms. He noticed an open library book on the little table, the French novel Madame Bovary, bent the corner of the open page, and asked their permission to take it with him. Ignoring their objections that it was a library book, he slipped it into his pocket. He sat down by the open window and, seeing a card table with chalk marks, asked who played. They told him that Nastasia Philippovna used to play cards with Rogozin every evening. Fools, preference, millers, whist, on trumps, all the games, and that they had started playing just lately, on their return to Petersburg from Pavlovsk, because Nastasia Philippovna kept complaining of being bored, and Rogozin sat all evening without saying a word and couldn't talk about anything. She often wept. The following evening Rogozin suddenly brought out a pack of cards from his pocket. Nastasia Philippovna had laughed at this and they had started to play. The prince asked where the cards were that they had played with, but they could not be found. Rogozin always used to bring the cards in himself, a new pack every day, then take them away with him. The ladies advised him to go and try Rogozin again, and give a good hard knock, not now but during the evening, perhaps he'll be there. The widow volunteered to go to Daria Alexeyevna's in Pavlovsk and find out if they knew anything. They asked the prince to call again at 10 that evening, if only to make arrangements for the next day. In spite of all their heartening and reassuring words, the prince was overwhelmed by despair. He reached his hotel in a state of unutterable despondency. The dust and heat of a Petersburg summer crushed him like a vice. He had been jostled by hard-faced or drunken men as he stared aimlessly at passing faces and perhaps walked much further than he need have done. It was almost evening by the time he entered his room. He decided to rest for a while before following the lady's advice and going to Rogozin's again. He sat down on the sofa and, leaning his elbows on the table, began to ponder the situation. Goodness knows how long he sat there, or what he was thinking about. There were many things he dreaded, and he sensed painfully and poignantly that he was horribly afraid. He thought of Vera Lebedeva, then it struck him that perhaps Lebedev knew something about all this, and if he didn't he could find out quicker and more easily than he, the prince, could. Then he remembered Ippolit and that Rogozin used to go and visit him. Then he recalled Rogozin himself, recently at the memorial service, then in the park, then suddenly here in the corridor, when he had hidden that time in the corner and waited for him with a knife. He was remembering the eyes now, the eyes watching in the darkness. He shuddered, the tantalizing thought of earlier in the day now suddenly entered his mind. It was partly that, if Rogozin was in Petersburg, then even if he did conceal himself for a while, the inevitable upshot would be that he would come to him, the prince, with good or evil intent, as he had done then. At least if Rogozin wanted to see him for any reason, there was nowhere for him to come but here, to this selfsame corridor. Rogozin didn't know his address, so he might very well assume that the prince would be staying at the same hotel. At any rate, he would try looking for him here, if he needed him badly enough. And who knew, perhaps he would need him badly? So his thoughts ran, and the idea seemed quite a plausible one for some reason. He would not have been able to say why, had he tried to explore his thinking. Why, for instance, should Rogozin need him all of a sudden, and why was it out of the question that they should never meet at all? But the thought was a painful one. If he's all right, he won't come, the prince pursued his train of thought. He's more likely to come if he's unhappy, and he will surely be unhappy. Of course, if he was convinced of that, he ought to wait for Rogozin at home, in his hotel room, but this new thought of his wouldn't let him sit still. He seized his hat and ran. Out in the corridor it was already almost dark. What if he suddenly comes out of that corner and stops me by the stairs, flashed through his mind as he was approaching the familiar spot. But no one emerged. He went down and out through the gates onto the pavement, and stood astonished at the dense crowds of people spilling out into the street at sundown, as always in Petersburg at holiday time, and walked in the direction of Gorokhovaya Street. 50 yards from the hotel, at the first crossroads, someone in the throng suddenly touched his elbow and spoke in an undertone just by his ear. "Lev Nikolaevich, come this way, friend, I need you." It was Rogozin. It was odd, the prince was so pleased to see him that he suddenly started babbling and hardly finishing his words, as he told him of how he had expected to see him just now in the corridor. "I was there," Rogozin replied unexpectedly. "Come along." The prince was taken aback by this answer, but that was at least 2 minutes later, when he had absorbed its import. When he did, he took fright and started flicking glances at Rogozin, who was already walking half a yard ahead, staring straight in front of him, without glancing at passers-by as he let them go past him with automatic consideration. "Then why didn't you ask for my room, if you were in the hotel?" the prince asked suddenly. Rogozin halted, looked at him, thought for a moment, and said, as if he hadn't understood the question at all. "Now then, Lev Nikolaevich, you go straight on to the house, you know? And I'll go on the other side. Just watch that we keep together." So saying, he crossed the street onto the opposite pavement, glancing over to see whether the prince was proceeding. Seeing him standing gaping at him, he waved his arm in the direction of Gorokhovaya Street and walked on, turning every minute to look at the prince and urge him on to follow. He was evidently relieved to see that he had understood him and wasn't coming over to his pavement. It occurred to the prince that Rogozin was looking out for someone, and had crossed over so as not to miss them. Only why on earth didn't he say who it was? They went on in this way some 500 yards and, all of a sudden, the prince began shaking. Rogozin had not stopped glancing back, though he did it less often. The prince could contain himself no longer and beckoned to him. Rogozin at once crossed the street. "Nastasia Philippovna isn't at your house, is she?" "Yes." "And was it you I saw earlier on, looking at me from behind the curtain?" "Yes." "Then why on earth did you?" But the prince didn't know what more to ask or how to finish his question. Besides, his heart was pounding so violently that he could scarcely speak. Rogozin said nothing either, and regarded him as before, almost pensively. "Well, I'm going," he said abruptly, making as if to cross the street again, "and you walk on this side. Just as long as we aren't together in the street, it'll be better for us, on opposite sides, you'll see." When they finally turned off on their opposite pavements into Gorokovaya Street and got closer to Rogozin's house, the prince's legs began to give way, making it quite difficult to walk. It was 10 o'clock in the evening by now. The windows on the old woman's side stood open as they had earlier in the day, those on Rogozin's were closed, and the white curtains seemed even more conspicuous in the fading light. The prince approached the house from the opposite pavement. Rogozin on his side went up onto the porch and waved to him. The prince crossed over and joined him on the porch. "Even the porter doesn't know I've come back. I said earlier on I was going to Pavlovsk, and told mother's servants too," he hissed, with a crafty smile, almost pleased. "We'll go in and no one will hear anything." By now there was a key in his hands. As he went up the stairs, he turned round to warn the prince to walk more quietly, then gently opened the door to his rooms, admitted the prince, cautiously entered after him, then closed the door behind him, pocketing the key. "Come on," he whispered. Ever since the Lydianea pavement he had been speaking in whispers. Despite his apparent composure, he was inwardly in a state of profound agitation. When they had entered the drawing room, prior to going on into the study, Rogozin went over to the window and beckoned the prince mysteriously over to him. "You see, when you started ringing this morning, I realized it was you straight away. I tiptoed to the door and heard you talking to Paphnatievna. I'd given her orders at first light that if you, or anyone sent by you, or anybody at all, was to start knocking on my door, she was under no circumstances to say I was in, especially if you had come in person asking for me. I told her your name. Then, after you went, it crossed my mind, what if he's standing there now keeping a lookout or patrolling the street? So I went over to this very window, drew back the curtain, and there you were standing and looking straight at me. That's the way it was." "But where is Nastasia Philippovna?" the prince brought out, gasping. "She's here," said Rogozin slowly, seeming to hesitate for the faintest instant. "But where?" Rogozin raised his eyes and stared at the prince. "Come on." He still spoke in whispers, slowly, unhurriedly, and, as before, strangely thoughtful. Even when he was talking about the curtains, it was as if he had wanted to say something else, for all the seeming spontaneity of the story. They entered the study. The room had undergone a change since the last time the prince had been in it. A green damask curtain, with gaps at both sides, was suspended across the entire breadth of the room, cutting off the study from the alcove where Rogozin's bed was. The heavy curtain was drawn right across and the gaps closed. But it was very dark in the room. The white nights of the Petersburg summer had begun to get darker, and had there not been a full moon it would have been difficult to make anything out in Rogozin's darkened rooms. It was still possible to pick out one another's faces, but very indistinctly. Rogozin's bore its habitual pallor, the eyes were fixed on the prince, intent and shining brightly. "Couldn't you light a candle?" "No need for that," replied Rogozin, and taking the prince by the hand, pressed him into a chair. He seated himself opposite, shifting his own chair forward, so that the two sat almost knee to knee. There was a small circular table between them, a little to one side. "Sit down, let's sit here for a while," he said, as though trying to persuade the prince to remain where he was. They were silent for a minute or so. "I knew you'd be staying at that hotel," he began, the way people sometimes prepare the ground for the main issue by starting with irrelevant details off the point. As soon as I got to the corridor, I thought to myself, maybe he's sitting waiting for me now, just as I'm waiting for him at this same moment. Have you been to the teacher's widow? Yes. The prince could hardly speak for the fierce thudding of his heart. I thought of that too. People will start talking, I thought, then I had another thought, I'll bring him here for the night, so this night, together. Rogozin! Where is Nastasia Philippovna? The prince whispered suddenly as he rose to his feet, his whole body shaking. Rogozin also got up. There, he whispered, nodding towards the curtain. Asleep, whispered the prince. Again Rogozin stared at him intently, as he had earlier. All right, come on then. But you, well, come on then. He half raised the curtain, halted, and turned again to the prince. Come through. He nodded at the curtain, inviting the prince to pass him. He did so. It's dark in here, he said. You can see, muttered Rogozin. I can just make out the bed. Go closer, then, Rogozin suggested softly. The prince walked still closer, one step, another, then stopped. He stood there taking it in for a minute or two, neither uttered a word all the time they were standing by the bed. The prince's heart was beating so loudly, it seemed to be audible in the deathly silence of the room. But he had by now peered closely enough to make out the whole of the bed. Someone lay asleep upon it, absolutely motionless, not the slightest rustle could be heard, not the faintest breath. The sleeper was shrouded from head to toe in a white sheet, but the limbs were somehow only vaguely discernible. All that could be seen from the raised outlines was that a human figure was stretched out there. All about, in disordered heaps on the bed, the foot of the bed, the armchairs, the floor even, discarded garments were scattered, the rich white silk gown, flowers, ribbons. On the small table by the headboard, glittering diamonds lay discarded and scattered about. At the foot of the bed, lace of some kind had been crumpled up, and on this white lace the end of a bare foot peeped out from under the sheet. It looked as if it had been carved out of marble, and was horribly still. As he gazed, the prince felt that the longer he went on looking the more still and deathlike the room became. Suddenly a fly began buzzing and flew about over the bed before settling down near the headboard. The prince shuddered. Let's go back, Rogozin touched his hand. They went out and sat down in the same chairs, again facing one another. The prince was trembling with increasing violence and kept his eyes fixed questioningly on Rogozin's face. I see you're trembling there, Lev Nikolaevich, said Rogozin at length, almost the way you do when you're ill. Remember how it was in Moscow? Or once just before a fit? I can't think what I would do with you. The prince listened hard, straining his utmost to understand, his questioning expression unaltered. It was you, he finally got out, nodding towards the curtain. It was me, whispered Rogozin, and dropped his eyes. They were silent for some 5 minutes. Because, Rogozin resumed, as if the interruption had not occurred, because if you were to be ill now, and have a fit and shout out, someone might hear you in the street or the yard and realize there's someone spending the night in here, then they'll come knocking and come in, because they all think I'm not at home. I haven't lit a candle so they won't guess out there in the street or the yard. Because when I go out, I take the keys with me as well and nobody comes in to tidy up if I'm not here for 3 or 4 days, that's how I've arranged things. So nobody finds out we're here for the night. Wait a moment, said the prince. Earlier on I asked the porter and the maid whether Nastasia Philippovna had spent the night here? They must know already. I know you asked them. I told Pafnativna that Nastasia Filipovna called in yesterday and only stayed 10 minutes before she went back to Pavlovsk the same evening. They don't know she stayed the night here, nobody does. Last night we came in as quietly as you and I did today. On the way here I thought she'd never come in on the quiet, but not a bit of it. Whispers, walks on tiptoe, gathers up her skirts round her, holds them in her hands to stop them rustling, wags her finger at me on the stairs. It was all because she was afraid of you. On the train she was out of her mind, she was so scared, and it was she who wanted to spend the night at my place. At first I thought to take her to the widow's flat, not a bit of it. He'll find me there first thing in the morning, you can hide me in first thing tomorrow, it's off to Moscow. Then she wanted to go to Oriol for some reason. As she was going to bed, she was still saying we'd go to Oriol. Wait a moment, what are you going to do now, Parfian? What is it you want to do? You see, I'm not sure about you, you're all of a tremble. We'll spend the night here, together. There's no bed in here besides that one, so I thought we'd take the cushions off the 2 sofas and I'll make them up here by the curtain, for you and me, so we can be together. Because if they get in, they'll start looking round or searching, they'll see her at once and take her away. They'll start questioning me, and I'll tell them it was me, and they'll take me away straight away as well. So let her lie there near us, near you and me. Yes, yes, the prince assented fervently. So no confessions and no taking her away. And not for anything, resolved the prince. No, certainly not. So I've decided not to give her up on any account, my lad, not to anybody. We'll spend a quiet night. I've just been out for an hour this morning, the rest of the time I've been with her. And then I went to fetch you this evening. The only thing is the smell in this hot weather. Can you smell anything or not? Perhaps I do, I don't know. There'll probably be a smell by morning. I've wrapped her in oilcloth, good quality, and a sheet on top of that, and put 4 open bottles of Zhidana fluid by her. They're there now. Like they did, in Moscow? It's because of the smell, friend, and you see how she's lying. In the morning, when it gets light, have a look. What's the matter, can't you even stand up? Rogozin asked in nervous surprise, seeing the prince trembling so badly that he couldn't get to his feet. My legs won't carry me, mumbled the prince. It's from fright, I know. Once the fear passes, then I'll get up. Wait a minute though, you just wait there till I make our bed up, then you can lie down, both of us, and we'll listen, because I still don't know, lad. I still don't know everything yet, so I'm telling you in good time, so that you know all about it in advance. Mumbling these obscure words, Rogozin started making up the bed. It was evident that he'd thought up the idea of the beds possibly as early as that morning. He had lain down on the sofa the previous night. But the sofa couldn't accommodate 2, and he was resolved they should lie side by side, which was why, with much effort, he now dragged cushions of all shapes and sizes from the 2 sofas right across the room and placed them right by the end of the curtain. Somehow or other the bed was made ready. He then went over to the prince, took him tenderly and rapturously by the hand, raised him up, and led him over to the bed. It seemed, however, that the prince was able to walk by himself, so his fear was passing. However, he still continued to shake. Because, friend, Rogozin began abruptly, placing the prince on the left and better cushion, while himself stretching out on the right side, hands clasped behind his head, but without undressing. It's hot now and of course there'll be a smell. I'm afraid to open the windows, Mama has some vases of flowers, they smell lovely. I thought I might bring them in, but Paphnatevna would guess something, because she's inquisitive." "Yes, she is," assented the prince. "Should I buy some set bouquets and flowers all round her? But I think it would be a pitiful sight, all flowers, eh?" "Listen," said the prince, seeming to get muddled as he sought the right question to put, and kept forgetting it at once. "Listen, tell me, how did you do it to her? A knife? That knife? That knife. Wait. I want to ask you something else, Parthian. I want to ask you a lot of things, about everything, but better tell me to begin with, first and foremost, so that I know, did you mean to kill her before my wedding, before the ceremony, at the church door, with the knife? Did you or not?" "I don't know whether I did or not," Rogozin replied coldly, seemingly rather surprised at the question and not understanding its import. "Did you never take the knife to Pavlovsk?" "Never. I can only tell you this about that knife, Lev Nikolaevich," he added after a pause. "I took it out of the locked drawer this morning, because it all happened this morning, sometime after 3. I had kept it as a bookmark all this time. And there's another strange thing, the knife only went in about 3 or 4 inches, just under the left breast, and there was only about a spoonful of blood came out on her chemise, no more than that." That, the prince sat up in fearful agitation. That I know, I've read about it, it's called an internal hemorrhage. Sometimes there isn't a drop. That's if the blow goes straight to the heart. Wait, did you hear that? Rogozin broke in swiftly, sitting up fearfully on the cushions. Did you hear? No, the prince replied just as quickly and fearfully, looking at Rogozin. Footsteps. You hear? In the drawing room, both strained their ears. I can hear, whispered the prince firmly. Footsteps? Yes. Shall I bolt the door or not? Bolt it. The door was bolted and both lay down again. For a long time neither spoke. Ah, yes, hissed the prince in his former rapid and agitated whisper, as if he had caught the thread of his thoughts and greatly feared to lose it again. He even sprang up in bed. Yes, that's what I wanted, those cards. Cards. They say you played cards with her? Yes, I did, said Rogozin after a short silence. Where are those cards, then? Here they are, Rogozin said, after an even longer pause, here. He drew out an old pack of cards, wrapped in paper, and held them out to the prince. He took them, but seemed bewildered. A new feeling, melancholy and desolate, oppressed his heart. All at once he had become aware that at that moment, and for some time past, he had not been saying what he ought to have been saying, not doing what he should have been doing, and that these cards he held in his hands and had been so pleased about, could avail nothing, nothing at all now. He got to his feet and flung up his arms. Rogozin was lying stock-still and seemed not to hear or see his movements, yet his eyes shone brightly through the darkness and were wide open and unmoving. The prince sat down in a chair and began regarding him with terror. Half an hour passed. All at once Rogozin uttered a loud and abrupt shout and began to laugh, apparently oblivious of the need to whisper. That officer, remember, how she lashed that officer at the music with a riding crop, remember?
Ah.
And the cadet. That came running up. The prince sprang from his chair in fresh alarm. When Rogozin subsided, which happened suddenly, The prince bent quietly over him, seated himself close by, and with heart thumping and breathing heavily began to look closely at him. Rogozin did not turn his head towards him, and indeed seemed oblivious of him altogether. The prince watched and waited. Time passed, and it began to grow light. From time to time Rogozin began muttering, loudly, harshly, incoherently. He began to utter short screams and laugh. The prince reached out his trembling hand and gently touched his head, his hair, stroking them and his cheeks. There was nothing more he could do. He began shaking again himself, and his legs again suddenly gave way under him. A totally new sensation of infinite anguish was oppressing his heart. Meanwhile it had grown quite light. At length, he lay down on the cushions, as though in utter exhaustion or despair, and pressed his face against the pale and motionless face of Rogozin. Tears flowed from his eyes onto Rogozin's face, but perhaps he was no longer aware of his tears and knew nothing of them. At all events, when, many hours later, the door opened and people came in, they found the murderer totally unconscious and in a raging fever. The prince was sitting motionless beside him on the cushions, and every time the sick man went into bouts of delirium or shouting, he hurriedly passed his trembling hand gently across his hair and cheeks, as though caressing and soothing him. But he no longer understood the questions that were put to him and did not recognize the people who had come into the room and surrounded him. And if Schneider himself had arrived from Switzerland at this moment to see his former pupil and patient, remembering the state in which the prince had sometimes been during his first year of treatment, he would have washed his hands of him and said, as he had then, "An idiot." 12. The teacher's widow, who had rushed off to Pavlovsk, went straight to Darya Alexeyevna, still upset after the previous day's events, and by telling her everything she knew contrived to alarm her thoroughly. Both ladies decided to get in touch with Lebedev, who was also much agitated, being his tenant's friend as well as his landlord. Vera Lebedeva recounted everything she knew. On Lebedev's advice, it was decided that all three of them should go to Petersburg in order to avert, as quickly as possible, what might well happen. Thus it came to pass that, at around 11 o'clock the following morning, Rogozin's apartment was opened in the presence of the police, Lebedev, the ladies, and Rogozin's brother, Semyon Semyonovich Rogozin, who lived in one of the wings of the house. The greatest assistance in the matter was furnished by the porter, who stated that he had seen Parfen Semyonovich and a friend entering by the porch in what looked like a surreptitious manner. After this statement there was no hesitation in breaking down the door when it failed to open in answer to their ringing. Rogozin suffered from brain fever for 2 months, and when he recovered, the investigation and trial followed. He gave straightforward, precise, and entirely satisfactory evidence on all points raised, as a result of which the case against the prince was dropped at once. Rogozin remained silent throughout his trial. He did not contradict his skillful and eloquent lawyer, who demonstrated clearly and logically that the crime was a consequence of the brain fever, occasioned by the prisoner's personal distress, which had set in long before the perpetration of the crime. He did not, however, add anything on his own behalf in confirmation of this view, as he had throughout. He confirmed and recalled, clearly and precisely, every tiny circumstance pertaining to what had taken place. In view of the extenuating circumstances, he was condemned to 15 years hard labor in Siberia, and heard his sentence thoughtfully and in grim silence. The whole of his immense fortune, with the exception of the comparatively insignificant portion he had squandered during his early debauches, went to his brother Semyon Semyonovich, to the latter's considerable satisfaction. Old Mrs. Rogozin is still alive and seems to recall her favorite son. Parfen, from time to time, but only vaguely, God has spared her mind and heart from any awareness of the horror which has befallen her melancholy house. Lebedev, Keller, Ganya, Titsyn, and many other characters in our tale are carrying on living as before, and there is almost nothing for us to say about them. Ippolit died in a state of dreadful agitation, somewhat earlier than he had expected, about a fortnight after Nastasia Philippovna's death. Kolya was profoundly shaken by what had happened, and finally grew very close to his mother. Nina Alexandrovna worries about him being too thoughtful for his years. Perhaps he will turn out a good man. It was partly due to his efforts, incidentally, that the prince's future was settled. A long time before, Kolya had singled out Yevgeny Pavlovich Radomsky from all the people he had recently got to know. He was the first to go to him and give him a fully detailed account of the crime and the prince's present condition. He had not been mistaken. Radomsky played a most energetic part in the future of the unfortunate idiot, and as a result of his care and effort the prince once more found himself abroad, in Schneider's Swiss clinic. Yevgeny Pavlovich himself, who went abroad with the intention of making a long stay in Europe, openly calling himself an utterly superfluous man in Russia, quite often visits his sick friend at the Schneider clinic, at least once every few months, but Schneider frowns more and more and shakes his head. He hints at complete destruction of the reasoning faculties. He does not definitely speak of incurability, but he allows himself the gloomiest insinuations. Yevgeny Pavlovich takes this very much to heart, and he has a heart, as he has demonstrated by receiving letters from Kolya and even answering them occasionally. But besides this, an odd side of his character has become apparent, and since it is a laudable side, we will hasten to describe it. After each visit to the Schneider clinic, besides the letter to Kolya he sends off another one to a certain person in Petersburg, in which he gives the fullest and most sympathetic account of the prince's present condition, as well as the most respectful expressions of devotion. These letters sometimes, and with increasing frequency, contain some candid statements of his own opinions, ideas, and feelings, in short, something approaching an expression of friendly and intimate feelings. This person who corresponds with Yevgeny Pavlovich, though the letters are rather infrequent, and has won so much of his attention and respect, is Vera Lebedeva. We were unable to discover with certainty how such a relationship could have grown up between them. It arose, of course, in connection with what had happened to the prince, when Vera had been grief-stricken to the point of falling ill, but the details of how their acquaintance and friendship came about, we do not know. We have mentioned these letters mainly because some of them contain news of the Yupankin family, and in particular, of Aglaya Ivanovna Yupankina. Radomsky wrote of her in a rather incoherent letter from Paris, that after a brief and intense attachment to a certain émigré, a Polish count, she suddenly married him against her parents' wishes. If they eventually did give their consent, it was only because the affair threatened to develop into a full-blown scandal. Then, after a silence of almost 6 months, Radomsky informed his correspondent, once again in a long and circumstantial letter, that during his last visit to Professor Schneider in Switzerland he had encountered the whole Yupankin family there, except, of course, for General Yupankin, who was detained in Petersburg by his business affairs, as well as Princess. It was a strange reunion. They all greeted Yevgeny Pavlovich with something approaching rapture. Adelaida and Alexandra regarded themselves as being beholden to him for some reason over his angelic solicitude for the unfortunate prince. Lizaveta Prokofievna wept unrestrainedly at the sight of the prince in his sick and humiliated state. Evidently all had been forgiven him. Princess uttered several apposite and intelligent truisms. Yevgeny Pavlovich gained the impression that he and Adelaida did not yet fully see eye to eye, but it seemed inevitable that, in the future, Adelaida's spirited nature would submit voluntarily and wholeheartedly to Princess's intellect and experience. Moreover, the lessons absorbed by the family, particularly Aglaya's affair with the émigré count, had made a deep impression on her. Everything the family had feared in giving Aglaia to this count had come to pass within 6 months, along with some surprising developments they had never even thought of. This count turned out to be no count at all, and if he really was an émigré, he was one with a shady and dubious past history. He had captivated Aglaia by the extraordinary nobility of his soul, tortured by anguish for his native land, so captivated her, in fact, that before she married she became a member of some committee in exile for the re-establishment of Poland, and furthermore had found her way into the Catholic confessional of a celebrated priest, who had gained an almost fanatical ascendancy over her mind. The Count's vast fortune, of which he had furnished Lizaveta Prokofievna and Princess almost incontrovertible evidence, turned out to be wholly fictitious. Not only that, within 6 months of the wedding, the Count and his friend, the celebrated priest, had caused Aglaia to quarrel violently with her family, so that they had not seen her for several months. In a word, there was a great deal to talk about, but Lizaveta Prokofievna, her daughters, and even Princess had been so shaken by all this terror that they were positively afraid to refer to certain matters when talking to Yevgeny Pavlovich, though they were aware that he knew of Aglaia's latest enthusiasms without their telling him. Poor Lizaveta Prokofievna would have preferred to return to Russia, and according to Yevgeny Pavlovich, she criticized everything she saw abroad bitterly and unfairly. They don't know how to bake decent bread anywhere, and they freeze in winter like mice in a cellar, she said. At least I've had a good Russian cry over this poor fellow, she added, agitatedly indicating the prince, who had not recognized her at all. There's been enough getting carried away with things, it's time to listen to common sense. And all this abroad, and all this Europe of yours, it's all just an illusion, and all of us abroad are nothing but an illusion, mark my words, you'll see, she concluded, almost angrily, as she took leave of Yevgeny Pavlovich. Finus. About the author. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, 1821–1881, was a Russian novelist, essayist, and philosopher whose works transformed the landscape of world literature. Born in Moscow, he experienced both privilege and hardship, from his early education in engineering to years of imprisonment and exile in Siberia for his political beliefs. Out of these trials emerged a writer of unparalleled insight into the human soul. Dostoevsky's novels, including Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, Demons, and The Idiot, explore the darkest depths of moral struggle, the yearning for redemption, and the mystery of faith amid suffering. His profound understanding of psychology and his unflinching portrayal of conscience, guilt, and grace influenced countless writers and thinkers, from Nietzsche and Freud to Camus and Kafka. Today, Dostoevsky stands as one of the most enduring voices in literature, an artist who illuminated the eternal conflict between despair and hope that defines the human condition. Pigeon, Publishing House, presented The Idiot. Author, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Thank you for listening to this audiobook. We hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this classic, follow the show and leave a quick review, and join us every Tuesday and Thursday for more timeless stories.